and why we're at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Because this, according to many of our community resistance, is a crime scene, continuing to pull out and spew out the same type of education that has brought us to this point. And concretely, that means that if you're inside this university, for instance, which was built to train colonial officers around the world, and isn't doing anything to change the logics of the law on which this world is built and organized, then we have a problem and an imperative to do something about that. In a very concrete example, we know that the world is at war, and yet life goes on as normal. We bide our time, largely because of the fear of fascism that is inbuilt in all of us and imposed on us by these institutions which refuse to name the elephant in the room. Our challenge is to say that all of these universities, if they are to be relevant and survive this century even, have to be used in service of our communities. Because if your degree isn't being used to serve your community, then you're being literally trained to be a desk killer, only capable of pushing buttons and administrating a machine of death, which is still responsible for an ongoing genocide of many peoples of the world. So what is the role of law, or a law student, or people that are building principles of law in our struggle for national liberation, in our struggles for sovereignty? What are the laws of the people that are actually capable of defending human rights, people's rights, Mother Earth rights, and defend a just peace? This is the question that is being posed in an alternative form of conversation, a type of education that we call grounding and sharing critically together, which sits outside of the logics of a four-walled classroom in a concrete building in the heart of London. And this is the type of education that we need and that we are implementing in order to take back power into our communities. So we must ground in the aims of what this session is about, which is critically thinking about what is this law? What are the laws that rule our lives? What are the ways that we're taught about law and how it functions? And what role does it continue to play in global white supremacist, miseducation, global apartheid and violence? We have today on this panel a team of very powerful members of different communities who interact with this question of law in many different ways. In praxis, in learning, through our grassroots academia, which institutions like this systematically deny, and who are actually doing work which implements the realities of decolonization, which fundamentally means building back sovereignty, taking back our lands, and stopping harm. This type of alternative space actually makes a challenge also of people who are inside these institutions, who might be studying law, who could be applying law into the concrete service of our communities. So we'll be hearing about examples of what communities are doing when they take back law into their own hands, and how that is building real power from the colonized communities of Abya Yala to Asia, to Africa, and to the global north in Europe. And in ceremonial fashion, we welcome our elder Kofi to join the panel. And so while we're thinking here and we're sitting down and let's critically prepare ourselves for questioning and reasoning together about what law can be being used for. And the invite of PRALER is that you sign up and commit actually to registering our abilities and all the different things we know into community service, so that we have armies of lawyers prepared to defend our people's rights when we're being shot down in the streets. When communities' rights are being violated just on principle of the illegal rates of air pollution. You just walk around it. I mean, all of this is illegal, but where is that challenge? And when again, nuclear weapons could be flying tomorrow, who is actually raising their voices about the real right to defend just peace? And what type of legal principles that needs to create as the world around us is being built? So we'll be starting this law as resistance engagement with Elder Kofi of the Stop the Maangamizi Charge Genocide Ecocide Campaign, as well as the Pan-African Reparations Coalition of Europe and many other formations that are linked in to the work of our Pan-African communities of resistance, an elder that's also been doing this type of work for decades. And this is also an example of the grassroots academia where knowledge is produced in the practice of real struggle for change. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here as part of the Planet Affairs Action Learning Educational Revolution. And I am very, very glad that one of its taking off points is this particular School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London that I'm very, very familiar with, because our community has been trying to engage with the students, not only the students who come from our own communities into this space, but also the teachers here and the authorities. And you know, this has been going on for decades, even before I came here. You know of the kinds of people who have passed through this space, the likes of Paul Robeson, Walter Rodney, Ivan Van Settima, from our communities, African heritage communities across the world. And therefore, I'm pleased that at this point, there is this continuity of their efforts in the PRALER being launched. And you who are students here and others who are in this space right now ought to see yourselves standing on the shoulders of giants. Giants who dreamt and worked and made huge sacrifices that the world you will come into will be entirely different. That it will give you your humanity and the opportunities to develop your human potential to the fullest, to the benefit not only of humanity, but of Mother Earth. That was the dream. That is what they worked for. And you know, if you did your research very well, you will see the documents that still exist. For example, the documents of the Pan-African Congress from 1900, in which were enshrined these dreams, which they wanted and worked to will into existence, so that yours will be a totally different world. And that they did not succeed was not because of their lack of trying. We only have to mention the likes of Walter Rodney, who studied here and navigated this minefield of white supremacy, racism, developing the concept from our ancestral knowledge of the guerrilla intellectual. Yes, the guerrilla intellectual. Because it is only as, these guerrillas seeking true knowledge that these spaces created for the very destruction not only of humanity, but of Mother Earth herself could be navigated, particularly by those of us who come from communities of the colonized. Because these spaces entrench the injustices of which a few think they are entitled to impose violently on the rest of humanity, even on peoples, who are indigenous to these islands. And by the way, that includes people racialized as black, if you know the history very well. And it is this injustice that calls us to the question of law. Because were it not for the will of a particular tiny minority of warlords of violence enacted into legislative instruments of reactionary violence, this space would have been different. The dispossession of the mass of peoples of land in this country, the enclosures, the violence that went with them, into creating this state, is what led to the creation of an institution like SOAS to train colonial officers for exporting this reactionary violence to the rest of the world, to kill, maim, and degrade the rest of humanity that was living differently. So from the barbarism of a tiny elite that willed its own self-assumed power into instruments of law, this was taken across the world to delegitimize other people's way of living, to delegitimize their systems of law and justice, of governance, of being with the planet in more harmonious ways than was happening here. And then impose all systems of coloniality upon them. And with bloody, violence, the spillage of which continues from the past into the present. You now have institutions like this claiming to be centers of world education, teaching nothing but how to live this violence of genocide and ecocide, for you to get professions out of this certified as death killers, to attack not only people in your communities, but even the very beings on our planet, to desecrate Mother Earth, that to many, many people across the world is a living being. All that thinking, all that knowledge, all that cosmovisions that were at variance with a white epistemic violence was deemed to be barbaric, rather barbaric, primitive, backward. And then the laws that began to privatize and take into ownership in lands where land could not be owned were then held up as the laws of civilization. And the people who stood in the way with their own knowledges and practice of a different kind of law and justice were seen to be the unjust ones. Many of whom, were not just executed, but even, imagine, in certain places, they were used for target practice. Their skulls were, used to play football, right? And the remains of many are still held here in museums around you as objects and trophies of the colonial fortune hunting. So it brings me to this question of the very existence of us in this part of the world. I include myself as being around in this country for over 3 decades. The reactionary violence of injustice, that is the everyday life we live. Do we really stop to think about it? But even up till today, We're not just living lives that scorn, mock, and desecrate the lives of millions of generations of colonized peoples in the past. Today, we're still living lives of violence that deny the right to decent life to the vast majority of humanity, and we think we are entitled to that right. And it must not change to make us uncomfortable, because it will take acceptance of discomfort if we are to enable the vast majority of humanity that today is suffering from the injustice of legal systems imposed through perpetuating coloniality in most parts of the world. When they stand up against all of that, there will be discomfort here, huge discomfort. Are you prepared for that? Yes, it needs preparation, because that is the essence of planet affairs. As a nexus of not just environmental justice, but also of reparatory justice and cognitive justice. The right for you to know this reality and to not simply understand it, as we say, but to overstand it, to get to the root of it, and reason through it for yourself with your teachers. Reason through it in your families, with your communities, so that you can begin to see things in the light of the majority of the peoples of the world, not your own falsely individualized self and the ambitions and vainglories with which you are miseducated in these spaces. And so was, thanks to the efforts of many generations that have passed through here, with whom some of us had the privilege of working as scholar activists from our communities, trying to accompany students from our communities from all over the world who come into spaces like this. SOAS has been trying under huge pressure to move towards what it calls decolonization, but not without the counter-insurgency moves of those who want still to adulterate it, to even co-opt it and reduce it to nonsense. How do you decolonize spaces like this without the presence of the indigenous communities of resistance, who best know what it ought to be like to serve their purposes? Why do you continue tearing students away from the decolonizational struggles in their communities to say you are teaching them decolonization in spaces like this, reducing it to empty academic exercises of no practical meaning to even you as students, because it has an impact on this institution and how it's shaped and governed. It doesn't impact really on what is taught in these places and what you are prepared for. It doesn't give you jobs and careers different from desk skilling and offering yourselves, to the highest bidders in the corporate world. So what kind of decolonization is that? It is just mere talking shop exercises in your classrooms to gratify, and massage the egos and pretenses, of those who are miseducating you. And that is what PRALER is here to challenge. PRALER is coming from, the intergenerational resistance of our communities of colonized people. That's where it originates from. And we are here to assist in challenging institutions like SOAS, particularly those that describe themselves as the world's university, pompously. Without consulting peoples of the world, you describe yourself as the world's university, right? We're here to challenge you. Okay, live up to it. To live up to that, this has to be a space of universality, which means all knowledges produced by peoples of the world in self-determination from their own perspectives and cosmovisions, they count. Not just the madness of Eurocentricity that at one point in time, even in the Oxford universities were teaching, the world that, the majority of humanity in the world was not human. Only those here were human. That didn't change because Oxbridge Dons woke up one day, and with spotlights of academic brilliance to say, yeah, actually, all peoples are human. Our peoples forced it upon them through bloody years of freedom fighting to prove our humanity and peoplehood on the fields of challenging white supremacy. And the scars have been passed on to us. To never forget this. So we taught the basic lessons of being human to these professors in these Oxford universities that today can, claim that they are the best in the world. And these are the common, lessons of law, and I dare say of just law. That you look at a human being and recognize the humanity in that person. And you learn the wisdom of our African people, who in spite of all the inhumanity that's been visited upon them, will still say, I can only call myself human through recognizing the humanity of all other peoples on this planet. And that's what Ubuntu is. And I challenge you, if that is not knowledge, then what is? If that is not a basic, fundamental understanding of justice, then what is? And so this is the journey we want to make with you through PRALER in terms of the lifelong learning back to what Mother Earth has long not only taught but represented for all of us. This mother of ours that you learn here to violate, to own as private property, a sacrilegion, to set up borders, preventing people from doing what we've done, particularly in quest of knowledge. People have traveled the world. How else has humanity gathered and shared knowledge without traveling the world in freedom? So when people erect this border of violence to separate us from each other, and then to otherize us, for us to see each other with hatred, cordoning off spaces that don't belong to anybody but to all of us. And then you sit in classes of law to lend legitimacy to this barbarism. Until you are coming into our communities to do what? This is what F jurisprudence means. The law and justice of all of us before this madness of whiteness descended upon all of us. And that is why part of the challenge of PRALER is for Europeans to rediscover their common humanity that they share with all of us. And to do that by rediscovering their indigeneity and going back to their Gaia as Mother Earth and learn the lessons from her gospel. Because there is European humanity. And it has risen through many, many times against the barbarism of a tiny few. That gets crushed over and over and over again with, sometimes you can say, with far greater, violence than that directed towards us. And it is for European people of conscience to stop running away from that heritage of theirs. Rediscover your true heroes and heroes who also stood for F jurisprudence, for just law. Stop making excuses. Stop running away from the realities of violence that is being imposed upon us through so-called legal instruments. Challenge the growing noise for nuclear war that we're hearing here again, and go back to what the campaign for nuclear disarmament was just a few years ago. Those bold European, men and women and children who said we're having no nuclear weapons as our defense. These are the heroes and heroes you should be rediscovering right now, when your mad ruling classes are now, trumpeting nuclear warfare to save their dying barbarism. That is a challenge of justice you face right now. Because if the nuclear weapons will fly, they will start flying in Europe. And many of you will live to tell the tale. Afraid of the climate and ecological crisis that is bringing creeping death in its eco-fascist wake. When the nuclear bombs start flying from those who you think are defending you, you and your children and grandchildren will stand no chance in seconds. So it's not just us the bells are tolling for. They're tolling for you. And if we can rise together and take law into our own hands and shape the justice that will make us human again, worthy to be, sons and daughters of Mother Earth, then you would have started coming along with us on this PRALER journey of law as resistance. Thank you.
So thank you, that's Elder Kofi Maoli Klu. And we'll now be hearing directly from Aunty Esther Stanford Kosei. I actually allow you to introduce yourself. But amongst other things, one of our mothers in a long-term struggle for reparatory justice, a scholar activist, a grassroots intellectual, a motherist, a decolonial Pan-Africanist jurisconsult, a reparationist, who walks the struggle and is caring to pass on this struggle and this knowledge to another generation to also take this up. And I'll allow Aunty Esther to introduce the work and the realities of law as resistance in practice and what that means, and also the long-term work of the Stop the Maangamizi, Charge Genocide Ecocide Campaign, which has practiced this law as resistance. Aunty Esther.
Greetings everyone. It's really great to be here, and actually it's so phenomenal that we're having prayer. It's so needed, and the introduction that Kofi gave is really sound in terms of the importance and the power of law. So both myself and Kofi are involved with the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, the Stop the Maangamizi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide Campaign, and many other organizations and institutions in truth, where we also practice law. But we practice law in our communities. We're both legally trained. I myself trained as a barrister, in my early 20s, a long time ago. And I wanted to become a conventional lawyer when I was much younger because I believe in this notion of justice. Yeah, grew up with a very strong justice ethic. And so all my education in these formal institutions was with that aim. But I can remember when I went to law school, which was at the University of Kent, critical law school, my eyes were opened up as to what law is and how it operates in practice. And I can remember one of my law tutors saying to me, whatever you learn in here is just theoretical. It doesn't get applied out there. And I thought, wow, what am I wasting my time doing this for then? Yeah? And so that led me to look for other pastures where we could actually practice law and be part of lawmaking. Yeah, not just being recipients of an unjust law, but to be part of actually creating a just law in terms of our people's long freedom struggle and actually having to always resist the imposition of law of the colonizers, of the occupiers, of the enslavers, who to this day and their descendants deny the justness of our rights and our claims to reparations. So how could I, as someone conscious of my own humanity and my people's humanity, continue to uphold that fiction that what many of us study in these full schools of law, which is where I went as well, to train as a barrister, is actually law, when there's no justice for our people. And when the British government, as many other European governments, continue to assert, well, there's no right to reparations for you because enslavement was legal. Colonization was legal. According to who? It wasn't legal to us. And that's why the thousands and thousands upon thousands of uprisings and rebellions and resistance in big and small ways testified to that, because from the first time an African was kidnapped from the shores of Africa, we resisted, because that was us asserting our law and our humanity and our right to be free, that nobody can take from us. So very quickly, after doing formal legal education, I got involved with various societies of lawyers, black lawyers, and was also definitely disappointed there. But it was on that journey that I actually met Kofi, when I was looking for a space where we could actually take our people's case, global case, which I'm sure you've been discussing in so many ways already, and realizing that there was no existing legal institution in the world that could adjudicate our people's case for reparations. injustices that we face, but rooting all the way back through colonialism and chattel enslavement. And so that was really how I gained a true education about law and resistance. Because in all my supposed thinking I had brilliance as a bright young law student, coming up against all these hurdles, so many legal cases have been taken in the United States of America, in South Africa, trying to gain reparative remedies. Not just financial compensation, which is what everyone reduces reparations to, but a whole range of remedies. And we're constantly being denied justice by these establishment courts. And so it was actually meeting Kofi where I learned that there could be a different way to practice law. And so he is a jurisconsult, and I also became one. What is that? People never tend to know what it is in this country. But a jurisconsult is really a specialist lawyer in applied jurisprudence, which is the science and the philosophy of law. But not just the law of what's called in law school black letter law, the law of statutes, but actually the law as it is manifested in the hearts and the aspirations of oppressed peoples who assert their law in their struggles for resistance and to reassert our place on Mother Earth. And so both of us have really dedicated our lives to serving as Pan-Africanist, internationalist, guerrilla lawyers. The notion of the guerrilla intellectual that was popularized by people like scholars, Dr. Walter Rodney. But there is the tradition of guerrilla law, where we actually have to go beyond existing law, break unjust laws, as a way of creating new arenas for justice, which humanize us all, and which close this separation between us and our Mother Earth and all of the cosmos and all of the ecosystems. This separation, which somehow makes us feel that our rights, even as human beings, although there is obviously a pecking order because of racism, white supremacy racism, and other isms in terms of intersectionality. So this work that we've been doing has really been applied to serving as guerrilla lawyers within our various organizations, campaigning formations, and certainly for the time that I've been working with Kofi, which is now around 22 years, in service to specific reparations organizations as part of the international social movement for African reparations. And one of the ideas that we championed very early was, where do we go to get justice? In 2001, there was the Third World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that took place in Durban, South Africa. And at that conference, there was a declaration by most of the governments of the United Nations that slavery was a crime against humanity. That's not because these governments came up with that. It's because movements from below, as a process of international lawmaking, asserted our reality on these legal international processes. Now, out of that conference came something called the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. But the wording was very trickily and cleverly worded by the European states. And it's interesting that we're here at SOAS because at the time, the representative of the British government was none other than Baroness Valerie Amos, who actually championed the British government's position that slavery was legal. So this is exactly the point that Kofi has been making about some of those that get valorized as being some of the brightest amongst us, that pass through these institutions, and in particular her role that she's had here at SOAS, that end up being used against our people's struggle. And ever since Durban, various European governments and other governments outside Europe have been trying to roll back the gains that were made, because they know what it means when even on a piece of paper, in a booklet, it will say that slavery was a crime against humanity. Our movements were also trying to gain recognition of colonialism as being a crime against humanity. But that wording was not as strong. And that should not surprise us, because at the time, Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of this country, and he's a lawyer. So what we had was so-called lawyers using technical legal knowledge of the establishment to justify conquest, invasion, pillage, genocide, ecocide. And it continues with the British government's denial of our people's long fought for right to a remedy and reparations. So all throughout our work in the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, we were grappling with this reality. And what we did in 2001, after there was this huge mobilization, and huge mobilization from below here in the UK, from African heritage communities who were like, wow, this is happening. There's a recognition that slavery is a crime against humanity. We must be able to enforce our law now. We must be able to get our reparations. That was the ordinary person's thinking. Now, we knew as lawyers that that would not be the case. But rather than just stand from the sidelines, we went in and worked amongst our people to take them on a process of rediscovering their own lawmaking capacity and potential, to raise their legal consciousness as to what law is and when they are being denied their right to assert our own people's law. And I'm here thinking of a really famous quote from somebody called Justice Albie Sachs in South Africa, when he was looking at and working with these notions of law as resistance. And he says, as a student at Cape Town University, I used to hear from the professors about the rule of law and its evolution through the ages. But I also studied in the black townships, where I was aware of the real law in the heart of an oppressed people. There was a huge division between the law of the courts and judicial processes and the passion for justice that made people feel human and alive. Honor, dignity, and humanity are concepts central to the law, and they are fundamental to a human rights approach to law. And my learned colleague here, Kofi, also has taught so many of us who came up after him. And in his own legal advocacy, there's a quote I want to share from Kofi. He says, the use of law is one of the most important instruments in our African heritage struggle for reparations. Indeed, the need to locate our claim to restitution for the damages caused by the gross violations of African sovereignty must immediately, for us, raise the essential questions of whose framework, whose law, and whose justice. That is the question that all of you who are particularly studying law at institutions like this and others, or practicing law, whether in establishment ways or in terms of our community law practice, that we're also going to hear about. And it was with that understanding that we went and we engaged with the legal dimension of our struggle for reparations in the UK, which is a global struggle because of the nature of the British Empire. So trying to seize the opportunity of this useless declaration that slavery was a crime against humanity that was never going to be implemented, we thought, okay, let's test it. Let's now try and sue the head of state, Queen Elizabeth II at the time, for Pan-African reparations for global justice. Let's go through the process, because crimes against humanity are part of the International Criminal Courts Act of 2001. So that's what we did. There was an organization called the Black Quest for Justice Campaign that Kofi and others were part of, and I became a legal advisor to, and we took this novel case to try and sue the British state, including the head of state, for Pan-African reparations, which included a whole range of remedies, including our right to assert our sovereignty and to enforce that, our right to community self-defense in terms of the wars of liberation that our people have been waging for centuries, and to not be penalized for that, and not to be classified as terrorists because we are fighting for our freedom. And guess what we were told? The Attorney General's office, an appointee of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and successor head of state, said, you cannot sue Queen Elizabeth II. She is sovereign. And in fact, there hasn't been a case since the 1600s. And this was at a time when there was another head of state on the throne, in power, sorry. Saddam Hussein, do we remember him? But yet we know what happened to Saddam Hussein, right? And these same powers were the ones also supporting the Iraqi people to topple Saddam Hussein. But yet we were being told that you cannot sue us, because actually any crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, etc., committed prior to the 2001 International Criminal Courts Act, we're not responsible for them. But if you can show evidence of continuing crimes, then go and report it to your local police station. That's literally what we were told. And so that in itself, taking that case, which was a legal, but also an extra legal, which is where we went beyond the existing law, was a huge education for our communities. And since that time, you don't really hear African heritage communities in the UK talking about lawsuits in terms of reparations, because we know it has to be about reparations enforcement by our own people's power. And that is what must be taught. The law as resistance as our people have waged it. Our struggles against chattel enslavement expanded the realm of what today is called human rights, people's rights. All our national liberation struggles have expanded the realm of collective rights. But how much of this is taught in these institutions?
Yes.
Hardly anything about the way in which, through us asserting our humanity and the humanity of others, to equally inhabit our Mother Earth, that we have been able to create this type of law. So I'm getting ready to wrap up now, and that is what we've been doing ever since the early 2000s, coming up with mechanisms and also helping to raise the legal consciousness of our people through their own direct resistance to different manifestations of what we refer to in the Kiswahili term as the Maangamizi, the African Holocaust and continuum of chattel, colonial and neo-colonial forms of enslavement. But it includes all the crimes, the genocide, the ecocide, the war crimes, the torture, the murder, the rape, the pillage, all of those crimes, the crimes of unjust law, the crimes of unjust war in terms of conquest that we are grappling with. And we came up with this notion that since the World Court will not avail itself to us and to our peoples and our communities of resistance and our autonomous nations, that we have to create new law and new legal institutions. And it was in that time that we came up with the proposal around a true world court or tribunal, which we refer to in English as the Ubuntu Gotla People's International Tribunal for Global Justice. And from that time until now, we have been traveling the world, gaining support, going amongst Aboriginal peoples, First Nation peoples, all Indigenous peoples, to look at what is our law, what was destroyed, what did they try and deny, because our law remains, and let us now form this international tribunal. That process is still underway. In fact, I've just returned from Holland, where we were engaged in resistance for the 12th of October with a whole range of indigenous peoples and other colonized peoples from across the world that converged in Holland. And part of the program was establishing a hearing of what's called the 1492 People's Tribunal, which looks at the crimes that our peoples have experienced and violations of our rights since 1492, all of us. And it was really, really great to see us coming up with our own institutions, our own arguments, and recognizing that we have to build the power to create a truly global institution. Just like with the Jewish Holocaust, they did not go to the Nazi courts. They had to establish the Nuremberg tribunals. And that is where we are in the process of going. But it can only happen by our people's power and linking our people's law. And on this tribunal, the People's International Tribunal, the Ubuntu Gotla, which will be a court of our people's humanity, our interconnected struggles, and there will be justices who will represent and uphold our people's law. Our people's law. And that is the law of our liberation. That is the law that knows that we have to honor Mother Earth rights, that knows that we have to honor Earth jurisprudence, that knows that it is actually unjust to make property of nature, to continue the pillage and rape of our Earth Mother. This is unjust. And so many of those who are trained in these institutions to become lawyers are now the ones justifying the pillage and the conquest and the eco-fascism and the terrorization of our communities and raising lands, forcing them off lands in the name of private capital. And this is what must be repaired. That disconnection in the way that we inhabit Mother Earth. So these are just some of the examples of the work that we are doing. And I close on where, some of the gains that we are also making. Because it was through constantly asserting our people's case. And as I said, we're both part of the Stop the Maangamizi, we Charge Genocide Ecocide Campaign. Because even for us to say we are going through a genocide, we were being told by conventional lawyers, NGOists, no, you cannot use genocide, it's too strong. By whose standards? Whose law? Whose framework? Raphael Lemkin, who coined that term, knew that the destruction of a people happens through the destruction of their essential foundations of life, their national institutions, their institutions of governance, educational institutions, health institutions. That is the genocide, when you destroy a people's cultural reality and you impose your own. And so we have battled using these terms, raising legal consciousness so that our activists are equipped in their everyday resistance, whether it's tackling police brutality, school exclusions, immigration problems, to use our people's international law in our own defense. And these arguments have yielded some gains. Most recently, in October last year, with the establishment of the all-party parliamentary group for African reparations, chaired by Bel Ribeiro Addy, MP, who also was here at the launch of PRALER on Monday. And the notion of reparations that we've been working with from our people's law is actually what is enforcing and holding up that all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice, which we are also championing as part of the all-party parliamentary group for African reparations. So we will now have a means through which to develop this global commission of inquiry, which we call the all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice, that will examine the crimes of British Empire and unify the international social movement for African reparations with those as part of the other reparation struggles that we refer to as the People's Reparations International Movement. And this is part of our law as resistance. And we targeted Parliament because Parliament is a crime scene. It is that institution that legitimised through the 1837 Slave Compensation Act that enslavers would be compensated. That was and the debt that was taken out was only repaid in 2015. So this is how we are practically, as jurisconsults, working, in service of our movements, as movement lawyers, to enforce our people's will and our articulations of justice in these institutions, but outside of these institutions, where we bring our communities power to actually enforce our will in these other institutions. So these are just some of the examples. There's a lot more I could say in terms of what we've been doing, but it is a huge piece of work. And we need foot soldiers. We need people to join us in actually developing the all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice. We need people to bring their experiences of law, their people's law, in terms of establishing, gaining the political will and the resourcing, the restitution of our resources to establish the Ubuntu Gotla People's International Tribunal. And we can start right here with a local bench of that Ubuntu Gotla People's International Tribunal. That must happen. And it is through that process that we begin to delegitimize colonial law and we decolonize the law. And we begin to replace it with the remembering of our own people's law. Thank you.
Now, when you hear all that, you understand why we're forced to be here. Because this too is a crime scene. Because none of that. Yeah, large up. Because the work is being done. And none of that is being taught inside these school buildings. So you get the real lessons of what is actually happening in real community struggles, in things like law, in recovering our histories, to build actual people's power. So if we can learn more from the streets of Brixton, where we're building these forces, and there are people waking up to these realities, then in these institutions, we have a serious problem on our hands. And when we talk about lawless resistance, these are practical struggles that could be the next generation of lawyers or young people studying law coming out of these institutions trained in community service from the people that are actually decolonizing the law. Yet these institutions are still here. And where are the people to stand up to them and challenge the fact that they can no longer have a monopoly on the type of knowledge that is needed for people's liberation? The concrete example of that work in community law practice is our next speaker, Brother Caul Grant, co-founder of the Campaign for Truth and Reparative Justice, but I'll also let you introduce yourself about the practical work that is being done in communities with the lens of lawless resistance and from perspectives that are not the traditional rule of law of an establishment. Brother Caul Grant.
Well, first and foremost, let me say I'm extremely grateful to be here and thank you so much for the invitation. I feel absolutely honored to be sat in between these two powerhouses, and yes, I hope what I have to contribute kind of add to what and expand on what they've already said. Now, I have never been to university. However, I have been to prison, and it is there where I studied the law. And I ended up in prison through injustice, not through any just system, but through injustice. And I was grateful. As a matter of fact, normally in prison, prisoners are not allowed to be sent in hardback books. But as I was representing myself with my cause, I had a friend who was sending me law books, and the prison authorities wouldn't allow me to have them. So I made a complaint in court at one of my appearances, and the judge then ordered the prison authorities, and he wasn't really trying to be helpful. I think he was being sarcastic as to suggest, what do you think you could do with your law books against us, the establishment? Anyway, he ordered the prison authorities to allow me access to my law books, and thereafter my friend just kept sending me in books, and I ended up with, if you like, a law library. So I stayed in prison, and instead of serving time, I made time serve me, and came out armed and equipped with the law. And ever since then, I've been demanding my rights according to what the law says. And I've been denied I've been denied the right to be heard. That's why I'm so grateful to be here, because now I'm being given the right to be heard. But yeah, so as I said, not only did I read the law and the theory of it, since coming out, I've been practicing it. And as a result, I've been able to travel up and down the country, assisting others with their cases where the authorities are bringing charges against them, etc. And because of applying the letter of the law, let me give an example. The law, Section 7 of the Human Rights Act basically states a person who claims to be a victim of an unlawful act may use that or rely on that as a defense in any legal proceedings. And so as a result of that, anytime I'm being prosecuted in court, or if someone else is being prosecuted in court, I'm able to use that platform to raise the issues. And now, as a result of the authorities not wanting to give us the benefit of that platform, believe it or not, I'm being allowed to do whatever I want, in even breaking the law in this country, as crazy as it sounds, without fear of prosecution. And the example I can give you, I drive my vehicle without tax and insurance. And you might say that's a bit irresponsible. When the police have asked me that question, what if you have an accident? I say, well, the state are my insurers. And if I have an accident which is my fault, I'm going to be the first to call the police, because it's as a result of the wrong that they have committed why I'm able to use Section 7 of the Human Rights Act, which says you can use that as a defense. So my defense for not having the necessary requirement of insurance and tax on my vehicle it comes under Section 7. And as I said, as a result, I'm being left potentially to, if you like, be above the law. And that in itself is quite dangerous, because one person above the law is all persons above the law. One person, I beg your pardon, outside the protection of law means all persons are outside the protection of law. And in particular, just as an idea, some of you, if you're law students, may be quite familiar with the Human Rights Act. Article 7 of the Human Rights Act, 1998, states no punishment without law. And that can be extended to no lawbreaker can be a law enforcer. And that is the premise upon which we challenge the system, because we're presenting evidence of law breaking, whether it be by the police, whether it be by the Crown prosecution, and most importantly, law breaking by members of the judiciary. And as I said, as a result of that degree and level of evidence, we're literally being denied access to court. I don't know if anyone else here, we might be denied access to a civil court, but being denied access to a criminal court is quite dangerous. But nonetheless, that's where we are now. And in terms of what Brother Kofi and Sister Esther have said, I mean, I think it's probably a good thing for us to collaborate, get together, because what the challenge we've given the authorities, it's either the law does and means what it says on the tin, or we are not entitled to obey it. And the fundamental principle of where we're coming from is that I think one of their most revered judges, albeit that he was said to be very racist, Lord Denning, he said, whoever may be guilty of power, whether it's the government, the state, employer, or trade union, the law must provide a speedy remedy, otherwise the victims will find a remedy of their own. There may be anarchy. So basically, as I've just said, you know, I'm grateful to have been invited here. We're using the letter of the law to either it does, as I said, what it says on the tin, and so because of what has taken place, we're able to seize property, and that's why I'm you know, impressed by what you've done here in coming to occupy this area of land. And if they attempted to move you off it, we would be more than happy to seize it on your behalf. We've previously seized Shepherd's Bush Green, and the Hammersmith and Fulham Council had to take us to court to gain repossession of that land. We previously seized a portion of Clapham Common. Lambeth Council had to take us to court to gain repossession. And right now, as we speak, there are several properties right here in this country. I'm sure some of you may not have heard of this possibility before, but there are several properties we currently have under our control, which we've seized using the letter of the law. And just as some of you may have heard of the Magna Carta, and although that is no longer in force because it got apparently repealed 3 months after it was established, because it was said to have been established at sword point, nonetheless, the protection or the issues brought about by through the Magna Carta are still very much existing in current law. So For instance, clause 61 of the Magna Carta, it said if we've wronged you and failed to remedy it, you may seize our castles and all our lands, all our possessions. However, once we've rectified it, you must return to obeying the law. That, although, as I said, has since been repealed, it nonetheless still comes under or exists within Article 7 and Section 7 of the Human Rights Act, and that is what we are using to seize property in this country, even as we speak. As a matter of fact, when I leave here, I'm going straight over to North London with a seizure that we've got planned. Once again, I'm grateful for having the opportunity to come along here and address you, and just to give some practical facts of how we're currently using the law in the community, where if it doesn't say what it says on the tin, then we'll take it in our own hands. Thank you.
You see, PRALER demands us to be quite practical. And when even young people in this country don't have access to housing and are being ripped off by student accommodation or being used as cash cows to feed a genocidal system, we have to read into the system a bit differently about the realities that we know. So we thank you, Brother Caul, for giving us some of the examples of law from below. But before we even go further and we think about the examples of law from below that are being used all around the world, we have to think about this as a global struggle to re-establish what Aunty has talked about as a People's International Tribunal. And this comes back to what decolonization means for law. Because again, we have to think about ourselves as which law when we say law. We say above the law, which law, whose law? We say against the law, outside of the law, which law, whose law? When we say law, and we're talking about the law of an African sovereign peoples re-emerging to take back our power, that needs to be defined by communities coming together to organize and dictate how we will do that. And the law students could be the people facilitating that journey. And these are the challenges of this time, and these are the challenges of even raising consciousness in our communities that has taken, with the support of the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, we Charge Genocide Ecocide Campaign, and the effort of educating and passing on this intergenerational knowledge and struggles to other generations and indeed other peoples. I will also now be passing on to Sister Marina, who alongside us is also a part of the co-claimant as part of the Global Majority Versus campaign, which is a live case being brought still by formations and community resistance around the world, challenging again and exposing the UK government for its illegitimacy and its rights and its violations of people's rights around the world. And these are concrete ways that there are examples of peoples back home, from the Nzima in Ghana, whose lands are being infringed by Western corporations and whose indigenous laws need to be restituted, popularized and visibilized and understood as real people's laws, that communities are finding these connections between themselves and getting organized and making changes about it. And it's through these interconnections that we see a far stronger case when we worry about whose law it is, when there are plenty of people's laws that are written, constituted, established, defended in culture, language, dance, music, vibrations, spiritual practice, that are truly asserting ability to re-exist and to sustain life. So I allow you to speak freely and large up Brother Caul and Sister Marina, who will join us now. Thank you.
Blessings. Thank you, family, for sharing. Well, yeah, we're, co-claimants in this case that has been taken. It is a people's case being brought against the UK government for its violations, for our rights to life, for our rights to family life, and for our rights to not be discriminated against in the enjoyment of those acts. Now, those are under the Human Rights Act. That's the Article 2, Article 8, and Article 14 rights that are currently being violated by this government. Now, when we say family life, which is the Article 8 right, our rights to family life, we went, we're saying, who are the courts to decide who our family is, right? Because for our communities, our families, is not just our mother and father or blood families, but rather our global human family, our communities, our people back home, our people that are right now globally being pillaged by this system of injustice that is murdering our lands, our waters, and communities on a daily basis. So as we take this case, as we're bringing this case against this UK government, it is not to seek for them to validate, this violation, because we know that it is an injustice. We know that our rights are being violated, and we do not need these courts to actually tell us that, yes, you're right, you were violated. But it was a challenge on these courts to actually, see, are you capable of siding with justice? Because, the basis of this is our rights to life and actually stopping the harm. Now, if courts in this country are not capable of siding with life or stopping the harm, then what is law really for, and what is justice really for? Now, in this case, as we brought it against the UK government, within its courts, the UK government issued a response saying that, the discriminatory impacts of the climate crisis are objectively and reasonably justified, right? This is written in black and white. And the courts, these UK courts, ruled in their favor. Now, I want to make this very clear that also we've seen mass counterinsurgency within this case, right? How the media also played a big role in distorting the image of this campaign and this legal process. Because we made it very clear that this was not about us as individual claimants. This is not me as Marina bringing this case, because who am I to speak on the global pillaging of my human family, we can speak on the fact that we're a part of that, but it's not about us as individuals, right? Now, whenever you saw all these Guardian articles and all of this, Marina, Kobina, Aunty, which is madness, right? We made it very clear in every interview that it was not about us, right? But the problem is they want to isolate it, because that's how they say, we want to isolate it around individuals to delegitimize the fact that people globally are being violated by this UK government as we speak. And, so right now this case, well, it is still in continuation. It's now progressed, it's been filed in the European Court of Human Rights. And so it is an ongoing legal process. But, we know that these courts, they will not give us justice. And so that's where the extra legal campaigning also needs to come in. As our auntie here, Aunty Esther said, the extra legal campaigning where, this case will be won when communities globally are holding their own tribunals, are saying we put the UK government on trial, and we declare it to be, guilty. And, as we give legitimacy to our own institutions, that is what people's law is about. And so, as we say, as we see that these legal systems, that these courts are not capable of defending our people's rights, it poses the question, which are? And this is where I want to share some of the very relevant and real examples right now of how grassroots communities, indigenous communities, have actually been using, their courts and their laws and the people's law to really bring true justice to communities. Now, an example is in Mexico. There's a very strong example in the region of Puebla. Now, I was there with the brothers and sisters and siblings out there who in Puebla on the 8th of August last year, there was a trial. Now, this was not just any trial. So communities there, basically there are 20 communities that were living in the volcanic region of Puebla in Santa Maria Zacatepec, next to Guanala. And basically there are huge volcanoes there with massive amount of water, or there had been. And obviously, you know, development came in the form of, you know, genocide and ecocide, as it usually does. And basically, you know, they established, you know, these, for example, the water bottling factory, which was called the Bonafont. Now, this is a subsidiary of the company Danone, which I don't know if you know yogurts and all those Danone, which is actually a B Corp company. You know, B Corp companies which are supposedly, you know, socially responsible, socially and environmentally responsible companies that are given these accreditations here on this side of the world, you know. And this company, basically, they had this water bottling company in Mexico called the Bonafont, and it was extracting millions of liters of water on a daily basis. Now, this meant that over the course of 29 years, this criminality was occurring, and so 20 communities were actually left without any water. Now, communities began to organize themselves. They said, this is a violence. You know, I have an artisanal well in my, you know, which my family has used for generations, and now I'm unable of actually, you know, finding any water. As I'm seeing, you know, trucks loads of water, of vans coming out to go and sell water from. You know, they're like, that's a violence. And that's an injustice if I've ever seen one, you know? And so they began to organize themselves, and they said, we're gonna put this company on trial, you know? We're gonna put the Bonafont on trial, but not only the Bonafont, but also the National Institute for Indigenous Peoples, the National the National Commission of Water, you know, the police, the state police, the municipal police, and the National Guard in Mexico, as well as the government of Mexico, on trial. So on the 8th of August, communities came together, which was the anniversary of the birth of Emiliano Zapata, which is a Mexican revolutionary. And on the anniversary of his birth, communities held this legal process where, much like we're sitting now, you know, sat at the table, had the names, you know, of the criminals on the table, and a representative of each of the 20 communities came and gave testimony of the violations they were living. Not only the contamination of their water bodies, but also, you know, the criminalization of those that were defending water, the assassination of those that were defending water, you know, the contamination of their skies, etc., and basically the neglect that they had experienced, as well as the ongoing criminality. Now, they said, you know, we know that the courts have never worked for us, and so we're going to build our own courts because we as peoples have the capacity to know what justice is. We have peoples have the capacity to know what is just and unjust. And in that legal case, they declared at the end of the 20 testimonies, they said, we decree that this Bonafont and this space that has been a space of death and destruction for our communities will now be taken over by communities and be made into a space of life. And so mothers, children, grandmothers barged open the doors, took over this water bottling plant, and turned it into a space of life for communities. Now, this is just one example of how communities are taking law into their own hands. And we need to be seeing these as legitimate processes. Where are the students, the institutions that are actually defending our people when they are taking up, you know, when they're fighting for self-determination, when they are defending their lands, when they are defending their waters and their lives? this is what these institutions here should be doing. This is what you should be doing, in your classes. Because, they'll be very quick to call our people, as our auntie here said, those that are fighting for national liberation, those are our justice warriors, but they will be very quick to call them terrorists. And they are currently doing that. As they're doing, for example, in the mountains of Guerrero with the Popular Indigenous Council, Emiliano Zapata, as they're trying to disarm them as we speak. They are calling our people terrorists for defending their lands and their waters and their lives. So who are the people that are saying, no, that is actually their rights to self-determination? Those are their rights to sovereignty. Where are the institutions on a global scale that are actually able to build these tribunals that auntie and uncle here were talking about? And, I think it's a beautiful thing that was done by these compas. The space was renamed the Altepelmecali, which in Nahuatl, the indigenous language, means the house of the people. And, we've seen similar processes, with the Otomi, for example, with the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples, who for the last 2 years have actually been occupying that government building and making it a space that actually works for communities. We've seen how there was a caravan in Mexico for water and life that started on the 22nd of March, which is World Water Day, and ended on the 30th of April, I'm pretty sure, and on the 28th to the 30th of April, basically there was an assembly in Morelos, and which is another state in Mexico where they're really, going through mining at the moment, and communities there, they actually wrote their own laws. There was a process of 2 days where people stayed in assembly and they wrote down their own laws. They wrote their own articles, and they said that we're not going to allow mining in any of our territories, and we declared that as communities. And they all stamped it. Each of their municipal bodies stamped the letter. They also had their council of elders sign the documentation. And so in their communities and internationally, we should see these as legal, as legitimate laws. So this process is happening globally, and I think, the call is to build those institutions that are legitimizing them and seeing them as legitimate, because obviously they are legitimate processes, but how is it that we're defending them as such? And I just want to mention quickly, because I forgot to say it before, but the Human Rights Act, which is actually the Human Rights Act under which, we filed this case, and also, what our siblings here have been talking about, this Human Rights Act could actually be taken away from us, tomorrow or next week. This government right now is actually trying to dismantle the Human Rights Act, and that's something that we need to be very aware about as we carry on. But yeah, this is why, I hope you guys look at the banner here. It says, aquí se respeta la ley de los pueblos, which is a sign that we had written up in El Altepelmecali, which says, here we respect the law of the people. And yeah, I want to end with that.
So we've heard from what could go on forever, which is that there are millions of examples of what communities are doing right now, this minute, to defend and assert people's law in all of its manifestations, asserting the basic right to say we are literally human beings. That is as simple as it is to say this is what we mean by people's law. And we've had the conversation about what is it to build these powerful institutions? What is it going to require of us? And why is there so much silence? When actually all it took was a table, some chairs, a speaker box to demonstrate what a bench of people's justice looks like. And you see, we started off today with a grounding about what is fascism. And we tried to ask ourselves, what is that? What does it actually mean? Because there's a lot of isms and schisms that we really don't actually get to the bottom of what they mean. And a brother shared about this importance of this example of Bonhoeffer, a campaigner from this part of the world, a campaigner for peace, a campaigner who wanted to end wars. And just before the end of the inter-European tribal wars, as we like to refer to them, just before the end of those wars, was killed and was assassinated. No different to Walter Rodney, assassinated. And it's ironic that he was killed just before the end of the so-called wars, or the so-called end of the so-called World War, because it showed what fascism does to keep hold of its grip on reality. That when people could see that peace might be coming, you assassinate those that are trying to push forward the bounds of making just peace a reality. So that all the rest of us remain scared of speaking up. And the brother said something that was so insightful, which is that then fascism is the fear that lives in all of us when we are not saying this and speaking up openly all the time. Because if all it takes is to sit here and speak truth on what is the reality of all peoples and make sure that truth is understood in our communities, that truth is understood in our school classrooms, because otherwise what are we being educated for? If that's all it takes, then we must be capable, more than capable, to build these institutions and actually defeat fascism once and for all, as the global majority and majority world peoples united in people's struggle. And another way to finish this was just to share a letter that we said, yeah? Now or should I read this? I'm going to read the letter to Fahad Shah that was written yesterday. Because in asserting people's law, we must act it out in practice. And yesterday we shared a political prisoners solidarity writing session because we realized, you know, what does it take to write a letter of solidarity to someone who's being politically imprisoned? In fact, an ex-SOAS alumnus, who SOAS, the university, does not speak about, called Fahad Shah, who is sitting in a Kashmiri prison in Indian-occupied Kashmir, and who are people who are speaking truth and was the co-founder of a newspaper called Kashmir Wala. And so to bring this into reality, we said that we would commit, at least in this letter writing, to bring this into every global discussion we have so that we would share with our people, our communities and our formations, our peoples of the world, that these names must live on. And so from Thursday the 13th of October 2022 at 1:44 from the Walter Rodney Freedom Square, we collaborated to the facts to say, to Fahad Shah and all political prisoners, to Indian-occupied Kashmir, the Valley of the Himalayas, we see you, we hear you, we are inspired by you, and your work continues to be heard. We are writing to you from the Walter Rodney Freedom Square, a reclaimed territory at SOAS. You are present here with us. There is still hope. We know your names and faces, and you are not alone. And you, in your struggle, have brought the resistance of Kashmir here. Your struggle goes on in many ways, and the world is changing. Movements are taking power in Colombia. Just last week, in Burkina Faso, a popular resistance movement has taken power and asserted the end of French occupation, the need for the end of the French occupation and pillaging of the resources of Mother Africa. We have powerful examples of mainstream formations for truth, who it's our duty to continue to mainstream. We have examples like the Sipok EZ, like our sister Marina shared. We have formations like the Economic Freedom Fighters. We have communities of resistance like the emerging young people throughout the Betoa nation of indigenous peoples, who are resisting against the impositions of colonial harm and violence. We have communities who know by instinct that our rights are being violated throughout the many, many, many territories of this world. We are sitting in a circle at SOAS, occupying a space in order to learn about you and your cause and the struggle of the majority world people. Many of us do not know how to action safely to continue support for you, but we're committed in sharing and making this cause known through our networks in Africa, in Abiyala, in Asia. Later today, we have a call with the Liberation Media Networks in Mexico, in Belize, and in Uganda, who are also in the cause of real communication and truth-telling. We assert that no cause can be held by prison, and that means not only you and others, but also the nations struggling for self-determination and all people struggling for liberation. We send our love and care from the heart of Aunty Rodney Freedom Square.
I'm glad that this letter has been written and has been addressed to Fahad Shah. Fahad was, a schoolmate here with a very dear colleague of ours, Sumana Nandi, also from India, who currently coordinates our XR Affinity Network of Asia. And I got to know about this only recently, actually, in this work towards the PRALER launch. And she said Fahad was in SOAS, just a happy-go-lucky, student, mostly studying and having fun. Went back home, but was confronted with the reality of his people in Kashmir, and just felt the need to use some of his knowledge and skills to start a blog, just enabling the stories of ordinary people who have been brutalized in his community to be heard through his translation of their stories, into English and social media. And then the usual happened. He was deemed to be a security risk, simply for trying to translate the stories of very ordinary, through a language, he's been, made to learning. And that was his crime, of actually glorifying and inciting terrorism, for, letting the world hear the stories of ordinary people, which meant that, if, he could be heard if he was just indulging in the hedonism of his student days and carried that, like some of his colleagues, into his professional life, right? And it's a very, very huge, alumni, SOAS Alumni Association of India, in which this institution actually invests a lot of money for them to organize parties, in India, right? Who say nothing about the situation of their people. But because he chose, just as a social media, hobby, literally, to let the world hear the stories of ordinary, that was his crime. So ordinary people, and hear me good on this issue, right? Ordinary people from his community, who are his family, who actually, were extorted from to fund his education. Extortion that has been happening for centuries, with the British, Raj in India, right? Continue till today. He goes and feels that, he couldn't do much, but, as a hobby, He could just open a social media blog, and try to let the world have a glimpse of the stories of his people. That becomes, a crime of terrorism. Not that terrorism visited upon his people by the British and their neo-colonial stooges in India for centuries. But today's, strivings of ordinary people, just to let those stories come out, he is the one guilty of terrorism, inciting violence. And I'm saying this because this thing about violence, that we can't talk about the violence imposed upon us for centuries, and the violence of today, makes some people uncomfortable. Right? On the streets of London, our young people deny their humanity, are programmed to be killing each other. And the violence is in the homes of ordinary people in this country, in this city. When we meet, people racialized as white, who don't live that reality, we can't talk about it because it makes them uncomfortable. What kind of violent silencing is that nonsense? Right? And these are supposed to be distant people who say that they are also for changing the world. What world do you want to change to when the reality of this violent world from which you profit and make a living every day, we can't talk about it? When we want to talk about the violence, say, take a map of the world, a military map of the world, and see who is encircling who with what. With nuclear weapons that can go off today. And it's a tiny global north encircling the global majority. With weapons that can destroy this world many times over. That is the life we live. And we're supposed to be oblivious to this reality. And when you go into these classrooms, you're not told anything about this. So what are you going to do about this? You are not the first to experience this. The generations of the Paul Robsons, a lawyer trained, an African-American lawyer trained in the States, who came here to study languages, knew what to do about it. And in song and theater, they organized resistance. And so, against this violence of today, which this institution legitimizes and blots out criminally, what are you going to do about it? The least you can do is talk about it and let nobody silence you. You can't talk. So cowardly, you can't talk. In your classes of law, you can't talk about this injustice. The violence that encircles you, that takes real life out of you. Who are you? What are you? Some of you can queue in lines to mourn some of the greatest colonizers of all time. And worship the stolen wealth with which they display themselves in opulence. That you can talk ad infinitum, loudly. But when it comes to deal with real issues, that is about matters of life and death for millions upon people whose only crime is wanting to live in peace. You can't talk. What are you studying? In your economics classes, you can't talk about people denied the right to make a decent living from the soil of their homelands. And many of you are being trained to work for these corporations that impose extractivist death on ordinary people. In Ghana today, my country, where I had to flee into exile here, and battled for several years to even have the right to stay here, right? The carnage and destruction has continued to point out even drinking water from our streams and rivers is no longer available to satisfy the appetite of those who want to wear gold, and use gold from Ghana and diamonds from Africa. And these are the realities you live, and you, who are supposed to be intellectuals, you can't talk about it. You can't raise your voices in opposition to this. What kind of economics are you studying? What is it for? What languages are you studying that you can't communicate this everyday reality of violence, even to yourselves? The University of London and its colleges have, amidst all of this terrible oppression, also historical acts to be very proud of. It was the University of London Union that year that when Nelson Mandela was declared a terrorist, that deserved to be hanged, elected him in prison as their president, in defiance of the educational authorities here. You go across this country, you see halls named after Steve Biko. These were students like you, mostly racialized as white, who defied the authorities of their time and even the governments of their time, and took these bold actions. And today they stand on the correct side of history. And who's taking the credit for it? These lousy British authorities. Like they take credit for us teaching, them that human beings are all equal. They're great British values. But who taught you? And the same way, you have to rise. And the first thing is to be able to have proper conversations, because you are entitled to know what are the actual realities for real people across the world. Not the fantasies they create here for you to indulge in consumerism and be sightseeing in London. Which is necessary, but go and see the realities. Our heroes and sheroes that are still objects in museums, the stolen things that you have in your museums here, which belong to us. And that is when you begin a real quest for true learning, not a nonsense you are polluted with in these classrooms. And then you take what you are actually learning. There's a lot to learn in London alone, not to speak about the United Kingdom. A lot to learn. Go to these places to learn. Don't spend most of your spare time, indulging in consumerism on Oxford Street. And then bring what you are actually learning, particularly conversations you should have with ordinary people in Brixton, in Seven Sisters, Shepherd's Bush, right? Bring those conversations of wisdom at the grassroots of our communities, where we have our own scholar activists, right? Bring those, learnings into your classrooms to question your so-called prophecies. And then make up your own minds. That is when you'll be practically walking this journey of PRALER with us. We are resolved at the grassroots of our communities that none of our young people will be taken out of our communities into spaces like this without us accompanying them right into these spaces to demand the kind of of education that will make them come and provide quality services to our communities in solving our problems. Because we know how the system works. The academic racism that is built into institutions of institutionalized racism like this place. And when we leave you on your own to fight your battles, you get penalized. And the most brilliant of our students get failed. And the worst stooges get elevated. So we will walk these journeys with you inside these places and teach you how the likes of Walter Rodney as a guerrilla intellectual student navigated these spaces. And so read also the declaration. Because what is, for me, some of the most powerful points is about ensuring reparatory justice works for you. Because our community, grassroots, demand for African reparatory justice, Pan-African reparations for planet repairs in global justice meaningfulness. It's not about anybody coming to give, paychecks to anybody in our community. It starts with you having the right to study what you need to know to be of best service to your communities. And for those who pillaged our communities in colonial conquest and enslavement, to cough out our resources, our financial and our resources, so that our communities can employ you to work for our communities. That is what reparations should mean. Not, Hilary Beckles and Barry Shepherd, and CARICOM, coming to make deals with your school authorities in this country, to get a few scholarships to come and learn the same rubbish, right? That you don't know about. When they come here, do they call you? Do they have any conversations with you? Are you part of the decision making? How come anybody can walk into any institution in the United Kingdom behind the back of the African heritage communities in this country and be making deals? For whom, about what? You need to stand up not to allow them. And this is not just about African heritage communities, Asian heritage communities, American heritage communities, but also European heritage communities. Right? Because you were also used, Europeans, you were also used, brutalized, dehumanized, to perpetrate these crimes against humanity in enslaving other people and reducing them to chattel and imposing colonial domination on them. Were you asked? You weren't. So we have a common reparatory justice cause. And that is what reparations must mean in a space like this. Bring out the stolen wealth, including, those on the crowns that the monarchy wears in this country. And let's put that to good use to fund the kind of education and employment and transformative adaptation careers that will make you render service to our communities. So there are very practical things that we should take from here to do, because we have to begin not just to talk, but to fashion the kind of justice that will produce the new laws that will make your studies in spaces like this meaningful, not just to you, not only to your communities, but also to the world. And that is how we restore ourselves to Mother Earth as worthy sons and daughters. Thank you very much.
So that is us bringing to an end the very concrete realities and needs of PRALER as it regards law. And we have a 5-minute break where you can sign up, you can engage in the PRALER materials. There is the Global Declaration of Planet Repairs Action that was made at the start of this week as to why we have to not even occupy, but reclaim and restitute this space for actual education. Just like that, let's go there. We'll have a 5-minute break before the need to move on to, we'll have to make way for the economics panel and economics of planet repairs, which is the next session. So class is firmly in session, but please do stretch your legs and come and make practical use of what this education can be.